Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. On this week's show, a slight deviation from the usual subjects. There has been talk in the media of governments wanting the ability in an emergency to be able to switch off or kill internet communications. One alternative to internet communication is radio communication. And here to talk about it, I'd like to welcome on board the Starship ham radio operator George Tuck. Welcome, George.
Hello, Richard.
Your other name is G4RNI.
Well, that's the call sign I have on the license here.
Right.
Yeah.
And we got here eventually because we did plan to record this show some months ago.
I've been going to do it a number of times. I'm sorry I've had to let you down time after time, but it's the illness I have. It's called fibromyalgia, and sometimes I get out of bed and I just go straight back there because I'm just too ill, but
right.
We got here.
Okay. Now, we've got a couple of sets here, George, which we're going to discuss later in the show, ham radio sets. Now, just broadly, you know, ham radio enthusiasts have this sort of a nerdy reputation. Would you? I went along to your club actually, and I fitted in quite well there.
Yeah. No, they're an okay bunch of lads down there.
Yeah, they are.
Lads, yeah. I think the confusion is that people, since the advent of CB radio, tend to regard the two as the same, but they're not. They're two totally different aspects of radio.
Right, right. I mean, I like to consider myself as a closet nerd. In other words, what that means is, inside I'm a nerd, but I try not to outwardly show it so that people will listen to me.
Okay. Yeah, I think that people have this view of weird people sitting with smoking a pipe in a dusky little room, sort of talking to people about strange subjects and God knows what.
Yes.
I suppose some do that, yeah. But the difference really between CB and ham radio is CB is for two people to talk over a short distance, keep in touch with somebody, maybe driving a lorry, keep in touch with friends.
Yeah.
Anybody can buy a set, anybody can put up an aerial for it and do it. Amateur radio, or ham radio as it's more widely known, is a means by which you can self-train in radio communication. And that's the main purpose of the license, to learn about the theory and practice of radio communication.
Because there are limitations of things that you're allowed to discuss. We'll talk about that.
Yes.
Talk about that later. Now, before we go into you know, the sets and everything, just want to talk about radio waves, because there is an electromagnetic spectrum. Space allows waves to pass through it, which are called electromagnetic waves.
A nice little chart here, which you prepared earlier.
Well, before we go to that one, George, I've got another one here, which is the entire spectrum. That one that you've got there is the radio spectrum.
Yes.
Which this chart goes right the way through to visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. So just to point out that all of these waves, they're all actually
basically the same stuff.
They're all the same stuff. They're just operating at different frequencies.
Different wavelengths.
Different wavelengths.
People regard it, they understand wavelengths better than frequencies, I think.
Yes, yes.
Even though they don't understand wavelengths.
Yes. Well, the wavelength is inversely proportional to the frequency.
The shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency.
The shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency. And radio generally operates on the longer wavelengths in the visible spectrum you would consider. So you've got right the way from wavelengths which are as long as a football pitch, which would be very low frequency.
Several hundred meters,
up to your microwave end, where
we're talking in centimeters, millimeters.
Centimeters, millimeters, and that's the radio spectrum covers all of those wavelengths. So we've got a chart here. If we home in on this chart here, we'll just put this on the screen. This is the UK frequency allocation chart, and I mean, you look at it, and it's quite. There's a lot of detail in there.
It looks very, very complicated.
Yeah. So that goes right from the low frequencies, 3 kilohertz, up to 300 gigahertz, and it's all split. We can just point out some notable parts of it, George. You've got the broadcast in yellow. Just tell us what those areas are.
The biggest broadcast in yellow is what we call the medium wave band, which is about 530 kilohertz to 1600 kilohertz, or half a megahertz to 1.5 megahertz, or about 600 meters to about 185 meters.
Okay, and that's medium wave.
That's the medium wave broadcast band.
And then you've got another broadcast band bang in the middle there, which is.
I'm trying to find where you're
88 to 108.
That's the VHF broadcast band, band 2 or FM, as people. It's wrongly called FM. That's the type of signal that's sent in that band.
Right.
But people call it FM. They'll talk about the local radio station being on such and such FM.
Okay, and obviously, so this chart defines who can use which bands,
That's right, yeah.
and it's drawn up by who? I mean,
Well, it's drawn up internationally by the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, say what bands can be used in what states.
All right. Now, on this chart, the very light cyan colour is the amateur band radio, which, when you look at this, there's not really a great deal of space.
No, we have very, very small allocations.
Right, right. And I mean, my sort of experience of radio was in the CB radio days, in the 1980s when I was a teenager. I stuck an aerial on my mum's
Suppose you had
garage
a weird
roof.
name for a handle as well.
Yes, I'm not going to say what my handle was. But yeah, I had great fun with that in the 1980s. I mean, it came over from the States. It was like from truckers, wasn't it?
It was a godsend at the time, yeah. I was interested in radio as a kid. I was about 13 when I first got interested in radio. And then in around about 1978, 79, the CB thing exploded.
So you were already well into ham radio before
I
that?
was very keen on radio well
Right.
before that, yes.
Right.
About 10 years before that.
Right, right. And I mean, it stemmed from basically truckers in the States who were bored. They were traveling such large distances, they would just...
So they could keep in touch with each other.
Right. And I've got...
And obviously give out notice of speed traps and so on the roads.
yeah. I mean, and they've developed an entire new language
Yes,
on this
this-
CB.
yeah, yeah.
And I'll just read out some of the terms. I mean, they've got the standard ones, which is 10-4, which means okay.
Yeah.
Don't know where that stems
A
from.
lot of these are used by the police as well.
Yeah.
As a confirmation.
Yeah, your 20 is your location. A meat wagon is a CB slang for an ambulance. The police are commonly referred to as the bears. So a bear's cave is a police station.
Right.
Or a bear taking pictures is a police with a speed gun. A bear with ears is a police officer listening to others on the CB. A disco tin is a police car with its lights on.
Makes you wonder if a bear behind means that you've got a policeman on your tail.
Yeah. I mean, in America, they have, well, in Britain, they had names for all of the different towns. So, I mean,
Well, I used to live in Stanley then, 1980, and it was Tool Town.
Tool
Because of
Town.
Stanley Tools.
Right, right.
And-
And Concert was Steel Town.
Yeah.
And I like the name for, where is it? Chicago is known as the mistake on the lake.
All right, I didn't know that one.
And Area 51, of course, is called UFO Central. Yeah, some of them are... here's a good one. Someone using a mobile phone while driving is known as a four-wheel phone booth.
I'd probably call them something else.
Yeah, or here's a good one. A road pizza is an animal that has been run over and flattened on the pavement. So,
Nice, advertising. Yeah.
so I mean, but ham radio, the CB radio is just one tiny group of frequencies on the
Very small allocation, yeah.
Amateur band.
Half a megahertz, if you like.
Right. Now, on ham radio, obviously, do you have a language on ham radio? I mean, if I was to listen in, would I be able to understand everything that's been said, or?
We tend to use a thing called a Q code,
Right.
which is known internationally by not only radio amateurs but professionals as well, where the QTH is a location.
Right. And you have a call, each ham radio operator has a call sign.
Yes.
Can you explain that for us, George?
It's individual, it's totally unique, and it's a bit like a car registration number,
Right.
although it applies to the person rather than the car. It's issued by governments in strict accordance with international laws to identify the country that the person's in.
So give us yours, George.
Well,
It's
mine's
G.
G4RNI.
Right. So what's the
Well,
G?
the G
then?
means England.
Right.
4 is the class of license, which used to be an A-class license. It's now called a full license.
Right.
And RNI are the 3 individual letters to identify the station.
Right,
So there'll
in-
be several hundred G4 stations, or several thousand,
Right.
each with a different 3 letters at the
Right.
end,
And
different suffix.
do you decide the RNI part, or is that?
No, well, it used to be that you were issued with a call sign, and if you wanted a particular one, as I did,
Yeah.
you had to wait for that one to come along in alphabetical order.
Right.
The RNI bit I wanted was because of my original interest in radio going back to 1971, when I heard of a pirate radio station, Radio North Sea International, RNI,
Right.
being firebombed.
Right.
And that captured my imagination in radio big time. That was 1971,
Right.
15th of May. And from there, I became fascinated by radio.
Right. Well, we'll talk about pirate radio in the second part, George. But before we do that, I just want to ask about the restrictions on what you can and can't talk about on ham radio, because I'm intrigued by this.
It's a bit of a mouthful. What it says in the license, I can't quote this word for word, but it's along the lines of remarks of a personal nature about which the licensee or the person with whom he is in contact have been directly concerned, or remarks about matters of technical investigations.
Right. So in other words, you're allowed to talk about trivial small talk or nerdy technical things.
A pie and it was beautiful. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to go back there tomorrow and get another one.
Right.
Or I can talk about
how to change
the piece of equipment I've been working on, or whatever, or a new aerial design or something like that.
Right.
But I can't say what I think, for instance, of the present government.
Right. Right. It's crazy.
I think the smile says it all.
Yeah. You know, so what? I mean, why do you think that is in Georgia? Does this stem from the pirate radio days? When did that decision made?
That decision was made before Pussy was a kitten.
Right.
And it's down to radio amateurs being able to experiment with radio.
Right.
It's not primarily a method of communication. It's primarily a method of learning about radio and carrying out investigations.
Yes, yes. Now, but what would happen if you started talking about politics and, well, say the kind of stuff we have on this show on ham radio?
Well, it does happen. People do talk about football, they talk about various football teams and the match that's been on and so on. We talk about things which concern us. And it's where it becomes a bit of a grey area what you can and cannot say. I definitely cannot go on and advertise a shop, for instance. I cannot go on the radio, talk to someone and recommend that they shop at a particular shop.
Right. But does somebody actually check up and listen in and police all of that?
We have lots of policemen on the airwaves, lots of, we call them licensed listeners, lots of other radio amateurs who would be listening in. And if you do something untoward, you'd probably get a friendly phone call or something saying, you shouldn't really be doing that.
Right.
Or in extreme circumstances, maybe be recorded and reported.
Right. So the issuing of the call sign and the license, you've got to pass an exam?
Yes.
Right. And
in my day, it was a City and Guilds exam. It was the radio amateurs exam.
Radio amateurs
and
exam.
It was a two-part exam.
Right.
Part about radio theory and so on, and part about the license conditions.
Right.
Before me, very shortly before me, it was a written exam where you had to write out and argue theories and so on paper, the way exams used to be. Right. I did what was called a ticky box exam. A lot of older licensees didn't approve of it, but that's the way it went. I couldn't change the exam that was there at the time. And now it's a three-part license, again, with a fairly basic exam, then a more involved one, then a more technical one to get the full license. So a three-stage license.
All right. And now, do you know how many license holders there are in the UK?
Oh, last count about 50 to 60,000.
50 to 60,000. And how many of them would you say regularly use ham radio? Because a lot of people they get into it and then they leave it behind a bit. They don't.
Well, I've done that myself. Yes, I've been heavily into it in the past. I used to do amateur television, send television pictures on particular bands that we're allowed to do it on. Not the TV bands. We can't use the same wavelengths or frequencies as broadcast stations or other users. We have specific frequencies we can use. I used to do television. Some people do satellite work. Some people do Morse code, which is a very, very basic form of communication, which gets through every time. Most reliable, CW, Morse code, continuous wave.
Right. Morse code.
Yeah.
Can you give us a bit of Morse code, George?
Da-da-dit, did-it-da-da, did-da-dit, da-dit, did-it is my call sign, G4RNI.
Excellent.
I can't sing it very high.
Right. So we've got two sets here, George. Just give us a broad outline of them.
Okay, the big one here, they're both fairly typical modern-day amateur radio sets. The big one will cover all of the shortwave bands from what we call top band, which is a bit of an anomaly because it's the lowest frequency we have for general use. There is another one a bit lower than that, but it's more of an experimental band. 1.8 megahertz up to 50 megahertz,
right,
which is getting into VHF.
Right.
It'll do various modes. It'll do the old AM or amplitude modulation. It'll do FM, not to be confused with the FM broadcast band. It'll do side bands. It will do CW or Morse code, and it will do teleprinter.
Right. So How much are you talking for something like that?
If you're to buy a set like this new, you're probably talking in the region of £2,000.
Right. And would you be able to broadcast all over the world with that? I mean,
it depends on the frequency you use and the time of day. Some bands are open during the day and some at night.
this is
Some at different times of the sunspot cycle.
right. So this is due to the fact that the radio waves will bounce off the ionosphere and off the sea as it's going around the globe. Is
Yes,
that
or
right?
they'll be caught in a tropospheric duct, which is a patch of warm, moist air
Right.
above the sea.
So what's the furthest you've managed to talk to someone?
Space shuttle?
The space shuttle.
Yeah.
But would New Zealand not be further?
No, I wouldn't. It depends where they are.
Right. But you've reached New Zealand, am I right? Or
I've reached certainly Australia.
Australia.
Yeah, I've reached a lot of countries. I have a logbook at home. We used to have to keep a log of every time we operated, the band we were on, the mode that we used, and
Right.
who we spoke to.
Right.
Nobody really ever inspected it, but we had to do that.
Right. So when you spoke, so did you actually have two-way communication with the space shuttle?
Oh, yes.
Right.
It was very, very basic. It was my call sign, their call sign as a confirmation.
Right.
And they repeated it back, and then they'd move on to someone else, because when they have one of these amateur radio windows, if you like, it's or the International Space Station, the ISS, it's very, very narrow. They obviously have lots of other things to do.
Yeah. But like float about.
Like float about, yeah, and eat beans.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, we're going to go for a short break, George. But before the break, we're going to go over to the poet in the pub.
Kill those seals, they waste the fish. I want seal pups on my dish. I can't live on bread alone. I like whale meat off the bone. 'Cause if you try and live on salad, you'll only end up weak and pallid. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. Ostrich eggs and piles of veal is my idea of a meal. Don't tell me I can't eat deer. There's plenty of the round here. Or horse meat with tomato sauce is hors d'oeuvres with my main course. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. Squid and swordfish for my tea. I like things that look at me. Bread and dripping with hominy grits. The Durham puma on a spit. I've even eaten a desert vulture. I'm at odds with Western culture. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. It's a bit better. Rob, can I have another one, please? I'm paying.